ようこそいらっしゃいました。
Hello and welcome. Today I would like to introduce you to a special wine story. This aroma, this color, they are perfect. This is Japanese Koshu wine, made in Yamanashi Prefecture, Japan. Yamanashi is a 90-minute train ride west of Tokyo, with Mount Fuji and the Fuji Five Lakes in the southeastern part of the prefecture. In the center of the prefecture is the Kofu Basin, which is surrounded by mountains and has few flatlands. Grapes have been cultivated in Yamanashi since the Edo period. Japanese wine is now highly regarded overseas, and the number of wineries has increased to over 300 in Japan. To understand Japanese wine means to understand the Japanese people. What better way to start our story than with the first Japanese winemakers?
どうぞこちらをご覧ください。
Chapter 1: The Birth of Japanese Wine. Yamada Yukio and Takuma Norihisa, the first winemakers in Japan. During the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, Japan was ruled by feudal samurai lords and adopted a policy of national seclusion from the outside world called sakoku. No foreigner or Japanese could enter or leave the country, and foreign trade was officially permitted only on a tiny island off Nagasaki called Dejima, and only with China and the Netherlands. For over 200 years, Dejima was Europe's only window to this impenetrable land. The country was almost completely closed off to the outside world, and under these strict laws, Japan developed its unique culture and traditions. Exposure to Western culture was very minimal, if any at all. This isolationist foreign policy, which had lasted more than 2 centuries, was dropped in 1853 when 4 American black ships, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, with approximately 1,000 crew armed with guns and cannons, arrived at the entrance of Tokyo Bay and forced Japan to open its doors to the outside world. A treaty to open 2 ports was signed the following year. This important historical event became the trigger for the modernization and westernization of Japan. Japan embraced all things Western and became fascinated by Western science and know-how, and in quick succession, fashion, art, and leisure. The West, too, was amazed by Japan and its unique culture. The United States and Japan signed their first true commercial treaty in 1858, known as the U.S.-Japan Treaty of Amity and Commerce. The shogunate also made similar treaties with Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia. In 1859, the port of Yokohama was opened for business, bringing an influx of Westerners to Yokohama. Japanese merchants saw this as a great opportunity for new business, and soon many stores lined the streets of Yokohama. For the people of Koshu, modern-day Yamanashi Prefecture, this new port was a fantastic window of opportunity as they were able to export their unique Koshu products. One store in particular, Koshuya, sold raw yarn and silkworm seeds from Yamanashi. On the second floor of Koshuya, people drank imported wine, brandy, and beer every night. One Yamanashi Buddhist priest from Kofu by the name of Yamada Yukio began the trial fermenting of wine with mountain grapes around this time, having heard how to make wine while visiting Yokohama. Fascinated with this new alcoholic beverage, and after making initial inroads with his wine, Yamada approached Takuma Norihisa, who was running a sake brewery in Kofu. These two important figures are the first pioneers of Yamanashi winemaking. They started preparing wine at Yamada's family temple around 1870. This was the birth of winemaking in Japan. Within just 4 years, Takuma's sake brewery began to produce and sell wine full-time. The two winemakers purchased cheap empty wine bottles from a liquor store in a foreign settlement in Yokohama and used them to bottle their wine. It is also thought that all of the approximately 860 liters of white wine and 1,800 liters of red wine, roughly about 4,000 bottles of wine that were produced in Yamanashi Prefecture at this time, were made by Yamada and Takuma. Their early success also led to them selling their wine in Tokyo, the country's capital. Wine statistics started being kept in 1873, and these statistics show that the amount of wine imported in 1880 was about 674 kiloliters, or about 1 million bottles. At the time, red wine was made from the berries of mountain grapes, which Yamada had been studying since the end of the Edo period. For white wine, grapes from Katsunuma and Koshu were used. In September 1875, an article appeared in a newspaper titled, "Let's Eliminate the Trade Deficit by Drinking Wine or Barley Wine Made in Koshu instead of imported Western liquor." When Japan was forced open by Commodore Perry, the trade deficit became a very urgent issue. Yamada and Takuma's lofty ambitions certainly played their part in helping to ease and eliminate some of this deficit. With the arrival of various Western cultures, Japan was in the midst of a period of rapid modernization. As part of this modernization, the Meiji government was actively trying to promote a policy of industrialization by adopting Western agriculture. Winemaking was a perfect match for this new industrialization policy, and thus the government started to seriously develop the wine industry. Proof of this is the fact that Yamada and Takuma received financial assistance from the Ministry of Home Affairs. In response to this new national policy, another pioneer began to emerge who wanted winemaking to become the pillar of the local economy. His name was Fujimura Shiro, and in 1874, he was appointed to the newly created position of prefectural governor. As soon as he took office, Fujimura told the national government, "Instead of just selling the prefecture's famous grapes, turn them into wine and sell the wine to foreigners. This will increase your profits tenfold." The progress made by Yamanashi Prefecture greatly impressed the government, who swiftly approved the payment of land in the prefecture that had not yet been cultivated, and provided financial aid for the cultivation of this land. With the government now fully behind winemaking in Japan, the Japanese winemakers were ready to take the next step. The idea was to make Yamanashi a model prefecture for Western-style grape cultivation and winemaking. Anticipating that Yamanashi, now one of Japan's leading grape-growing regions, could make wine a specialized Yamanashi product. Although the trade deficit was one major reason for this way of thinking, another motivation for government officials was their admiration for a new wine culture that they saw when they took their first diplomatic trips abroad. Governor Fujimura planted grapes and other plants on the site of Kofu Castle, built the Prefectural Industrial Research Institute, and opened a vineyard as an annex to the institute. This is where the planning and implementation and integration of the winemaking business took place, and included everything from production and processing to sales and delivery. Yamada and Takuma had already attained a level of success in winemaking, but Fujimura knew they needed help in order to further develop the winemaking industry in Japan. Fujimura asked Tsuda Sen, an agricultural advisor, to send Oto Matsugoro, who had been involved in winemaking in California for 8 years and had a very good understanding of how wine had been developed in the United States, to visit them. Yamada and Takuma, having received financial assistance from the government, produced 10,000 bottles of Koshu wine, sweet wine, and medicinal wine. Their wine was on display at the first National Industrial Exhibition in 1877 and was awarded a silver medal. The taste was described as being lemony, marking the debut of Koshu wine. However, despite being devoted to winemaking, Yamada and Takuma soon decided to quit the industry. There were a variety of reasons why Japan's first winemaking project, to which regular, ordinary people had devoted their passion, failed. Financial difficulties and inexperience, coupled with a shortage of raw grapes, ultimately forced Yamada and Takuma to abandon their dreams. There can be no doubt, however, that these two Japanese winemaking pioneers laid the foundations for the next generation of winemakers. They boldly implemented foreign alcohol brewing techniques that the Japanese had never seen before. They had incredible foresight and an unwavering approach to their craft to see their challenge through until the end. The never-say-die spirit of the Japanese, combined with this new wine industry, paved a new path for future Japanese winemaking trailblazers.
Yamanashi today has vineyards as far as the eye can see. However, back in the day, the vineyards were mainly in Katsunuma. There were lots of wild vines growing in the mountains, so Yamanashi really did have an abundance of local resources. In addition, being close to Yokohama, Japan's largest wine-consuming area, helped the wine industry develop in Yamanashi. As you just saw, Yamada and Takuma started work on winemaking in Yamanashi around the time of the Meiji Restoration. They had many struggles and learned winemaking by watching others. However, by 1874, they had attained a certain level of production and were making around 4,000 bottles of wine. The prefectural governor at that time, Fujimura Shiro, decided to support their efforts. He dispatched the engineer Oto Matsugoro, who had worked on grapes and wine for 8 years in the United States, to Yamada and Takuma in the fall of 1876, helping them to make higher quality wine in time for the National Industrial Exhibition of 1877. This was most likely the first time that the government and private sector had cooperated to promote any kind of industry in Japan.
Chapter 2. In Search of Authentic Wine. The Encouragement of a New Industry. Maeda Masana, Takano Masanari, and Tsuchiya Ryukin. The winemaking started by Yamada and Takuma was taken over by the prefectural winery. The winery invited Oto Matsugoro and Katsuda Jiro to be their successors. Katsuda, who had studied at a wine school in Germany for 3 years, and Oto were deemed to be excellent replacements for Yamada and Takuma. In addition to producing wine, Oto and Katsuda taught winemaking and viticulture to trainees from all over Japan. In 1881, Katsuda was recruited by the Ministry of Home Affairs to teach viticulture and winemaking in Hyogo, Aichi, and Aomori. He was also the younger brother of future Japanese Prime Minister Katsuda Taro. The prefectural winery symbolized a dream, the dream of domestic winemaking, and the dreams of the early pioneers. These dreams, however, were integrated into the national and prefectural governments. In Japan, grapes were originally only intended to be eaten, but there are, in fact, several different varieties of grapes for making wine. Even raisins were new to the Japanese people at the time. Japan's first agricultural experiment station for fruit trees was established by high-ranking officials who returned from overseas, and the cultivation of various new varieties of crops, including grapes, began. Around this time, another pioneer of Japanese winemaking emerged through the spread of Western plants throughout Japan. His name was Maeda Masana, a government official who would later become the governor of Yamanashi Prefecture. When Maeda was working at the Japanese consulate in France, he bought and collected seeds and seedlings of more than 1,000 species of plants, including trees, fruit trees, and grains from Europe. His greatest collaborator was the French agriculturalist and nursery horticulturalist Charles Balté. Balté prepared over 10,000 grape trees, over 100 different varieties of grapes, as well as many other saplings and seeds for Maeda to take back to Japan to be used by breeding farms to distribute cuttings and grafts throughout the country. Domestic wine production was now seen as a budding industry in Japan, and the pressure and expectation to succeed was firmly placed on the shoulders of these seeds and saplings, and the diligent research of the Japanese people. Maeda left Japan again after being appointed as the secretary of the Paris World Expo. This time, he took two young prodigies from Yamanashi with him. Up until his French appointment, Maeda had been bringing back saplings from France and had also become the director of a breeding farm. The prodigies' names were Takano Masanari and Tsuchiya Ryuken, and they would later lead the full-scale launch of Japanese domestic wine. Around the time of the opening of the first National Industrial Exhibition, Yamanashi Prefecture, at the urging of the prefectural governor Fujimura Shiro, established the Dai Nippon Yamanashi Wine Company to send wine trainees to France, the mecca of viticulture and the home of wine. The aim was to produce red wine similar to Bordeaux wine, which could not be exhibited at the Industrial Expo. At that time, the only red wine available was made from mountain grapes. In order to gain knowledge about growing and fermenting grapes for red wine, the prefectural government formed a selection committee where Takano and Tsuchiya were chosen by the Dai Nippon Yamanashi Wine Company to head on an excursion to France. The terms of the contracts for the two men were very harsh. Your training period will be 1 year. The company will pay for your travel and training expenses. But as stipulated in the contract, if you do not acquire the knowledge of viticulture and winemaking within the 1-year training period, then you must continue your training at your own expense and only come back to Japan when you can contribute to the success and development of the company. Of course, it was almost next to impossible for the two young novice winemaking villagers who did not speak French to be expected to learn how to make wine within just 1 year. They nonetheless accepted the challenge and accompanied Maeda to France, boarding the French ship Tanais from the port of Yokohama. Takano and Tsuchiya arrived at the docks of Marseille about a month and a half later via Hong Kong, Singapore, Sri Lanka, through the Suez Canal, and Naples. After arriving in Paris, they stayed with an acquaintance of Maeda's for about a month, and once they were able to understand a little bit of French, Takano and Tsuchiya left for the city of Troyes in the Champagne region. Due to the very limited amount of time they had for training, Takano and Tsuchiya were unable to devote much time to learning the French language. Under the tutelage of Charles Bard and Pierre Dupont, a practitioner of viticulture and a winemaking researcher, the two young men learned about grape pruning, cuttings, grafting, different grape species, as well as the differences between grapes for raw consumption and for winemaking. As early as the fall, Takano and Tsuchiya were participating in grape harvesting and winemaking, despite the language barrier still being a problem. It was very hard for them to learn the subtleties from the French experts and brewers. Nevertheless, Takano and Tsuchiya painstakingly documented and sketched the results in order to properly convey the craft to the people back home in Japan. Thus, working by day and recording by night, they worked tirelessly to master the difficult cultivation and fermenting processes. Through Maeda Masana's introduction, Takano and Tsuchiya were also able to learn how to make champagne and beer. In 1877, while Takano and Tsuchiya were in France, Miyazaki Kotaro, the son of a wealthy local farmer, was back home in Yamanashi, buzzing with hope and anticipation. Kotaro was the son of Miyazaki Ichizaemon, the founder of the Dai Nippon Yamanashi Wine Company, the company that sent Takano and Tsuchiya to France. Kotaro was eager to study abroad and learn winemaking in the real world. However, his father was vehemently opposed to his only son going to a faraway country to study, so he gave up on the idea. This greatly disappointed Kotaro, but he used this disappointment as motivation to jump into winemaking with both feet. As soon as Takano and Tsuchiya returned to Japan, the trio immediately began making wine together. Takano and Tsuchiya used the knowledge and experience they acquired while studying abroad to take charge of production, while Kotaro was mainly responsible for sales and distribution. This is how winemaking at the Dai Nippon Yamanashi Wine Company began. The first batch of wine made with Koshu grapes produced about 5 kiloliters. The following year, the amount soared to about 33 kiloliters. When Takano and Tsuchiya returned to Japan, however, circumstances had changed drastically. The government's financial support had stopped due to a shift in political direction from an industrial policy to an austerity policy. In short, spending was cut in order to reduce the government deficit. In 1883, the Industrial Research Institute shut down, which meant that the Yamanashi Prefectural Winery also had to be abolished. Dai Nippon Yamanashi Wine Company had no choice but to be dissolved. These Japanese wine pioneers all experienced numerous setbacks as well as heartbreak and disappointment. They did, however, greatly contribute to the development of Japan's wine industry. The outdated technology of Yamada and Takuma's time had greatly improved over the last 10 years. Diligence and precision are common traits of the Japanese people, and these early pioneers continued to hone their knowledge and skills long after returning to Japan. As well as bringing back the knowledge and techniques they acquired, they also invited European experts to Japan to further their study of breeding, cultivation, and the fermentation process. Winemaking in Japan was advancing, and these pioneers were responsible for it. There were still many bumps along the road to domestic winemaking, including the emergence of pests, which led to the extinction of European grapes. It was up to the next generation to solve these problems.
Oto
Matsugoro, who guided Yamada and Takuma, was making wine at Takuma's sake brewery in 1876. The feature of this technology was that it could adequately make sweet wine. The technology proved effective in addressing secondary fermentation and perishing, which tend to occur in sweet wine. Another feature was that they could make medicinal wine, which was important for combating the epidemics that were prevalent in those days. This technology was circulated by the prefectural winery to every private winery, and the development of sweet wine and medicinal wine, which helped the wineries survive through the Meiji era, was a major achievement of the Yamanashi prefectural winery.
Chapter 3: The Familiarization of Wine in Japanese Society. Battling pests and differing tastes. Although winemaking as a national policy was on the wane, the number of private wine growers began to increase rapidly around this time, reaching 945 nationwide. The technology and science behind winemaking in Japan had been established, making it easier for private citizens to enter the market. After the dissolution of the Dai Nippon Yamanashi Wine Company, Miyazaki Kotaro established the Kai Original Brand Winery together with Tsuchiya Ryuken. In addition to improving the quality of the wine, the company opened the Kai Original Brand store in Nihonbashi, Tokyo, to secure improved sales. The primary barrier for winemaking in Japan now was pests. The European species of grapes that had been cultivated in Yamanashi were almost completely destroyed by the pest Phylloxera. Phylloxera raged all over the country, and its threat did not diminish until after World War II. It was the bug that almost wiped out the world's wine industry. Miyazaki and Tsuchiya switched the grapes to American varieties and worked on growing them. Although there was still some variation in the taste, they were able to produce quality grapes. This, however, brought up another barrier for the Japanese: the taste. The sour taste of wine did not fit the taste of the general public, which in turn hindered wine sales. In the midst of all this, Kamiya Denbei, who ran what is now known as the Kamiya Bar in Asakusa in Tokyo, developed a sweet wine by mixing imported wine with sweeteners and medicinal ingredients. This was a big hit because it matched the Japanese palate. In addition to Miyazaki and Tsuchiya, a number of other winemakers worked hard to develop wine, and it was Miyazaki and Tsuchiya's knowledge and skill which became the base for the raw material for sweet wine. Despite all the setbacks that still surrounded winemaking, Japanese winemakers continued to make authentic wines while continuing to refine their techniques. Miyazaki and Tsuchiya's Kai Original Brand Winery launched sweetened wine and went on to become the largest producer of fresh grape wine in Japan. Miyazaki also opened a tourist farm that combined grape picking and winery tours. The famous scene of sitting and enjoying wine under grapevines was said to have originated here at Miyazaki's farm. Kotobukiya, now known as Suntory, launched their own sweet wine called Akadama Port Wine and helped sweet wine become a mainstream product in Japan. The hardships of the early winemakers of the Meiji era were overshadowed by the boom in sweet wines, and regular wine barely saw the light of day. However, there is no doubt that the various attempts made during this period were an important foundation for the development of Japanese wine. Chapter 4: Japanese Wine Today. Koshu wine recognized around the world. Koshu wine has been produced since 1870 and turned 150 years old in 2020. It took more than 100 years for the Japanese winemaking pioneers' hard work to pay off. In truth, however, their feats really only began to shine about 20 years ago. After World War II, Japan achieved remarkable economic growth and eventually entered into an era called the bubble economy. As people's lives became more enriched, the taste of authentic wine became more widely recognized throughout the country. Even though the bubble burst and the economy collapsed, the culture of tasting food and enjoying wine has firmly taken root in Japan. In 2000, Koshu wine appeared for 7 consecutive weeks as the only wine that goes well with Japanese food in Oishimbo, the famous groundbreaking Japanese gourmet manga. In 2010, Koshu wine expanded to London, the world's wine evaluation base. It was there in London that Koshu wine was labeled as the wine that the world needs to discover. Japan's enticing wines fit neatly with global wine trends. Koshu wines have floral aromas and delicate and distinctive flavors with naturally low alcohol levels. They are perfect matches for Japan's popular cuisine mainstays of sushi and sashimi, as well as Japanese food in general. In 2010, the Koshu grape, which is indigenous to Japan, was registered with the International Organization of Vine and Wine, or OIV. It was the first grape variety to be recognized around the world as a winemaking grape. Since 2018, the rules for labeling wine have changed. Now, only wine made from 100% domestic grapes can be labeled as Japanese wine, further increasing the value of Koshu wine, which uses only Koshu grapes. The word Koshu can now be written on the labels of wines exported to the EU. Based on the global development of Koshu wine, the public and private sectors are working together to promote fruit farming in the Kyoto region, which consists of Yamanashi City, Uefuki City, and Koshu City. This is called the Kyoto Wine Resort concept, with the aim of revitalizing tourism and the economy, similar to the concept of the region-wide winemaking scene in Champagne and Bordeaux in France. The day when Japan would have a resort space where people can enjoy the grapes, learn about the winery, and taste the wine in the beautiful vineyards would not have been thought possible all those years ago. But that dream has now become a reality.
There were a number of key events, one of which was the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. A factor in the great transformation of wine at this time was the worldwide popularity of fresh and fruity flavors. This encouraged winemakers to also aim for fresh and fruity wines. The next turning point came when preferences switched from the sweet to not sweet wine, since this was more suitable for table wines drunk with meals. This trend occurred roughly in the 1980s and is continuing to this day. Brewing technology also made particularly great advances in the 1980s. After that, and especially following the turn of the century, Japanese wine started being exported overseas. The next important step was the question of whether Japanese wine could attain international popularity. At this time, the people who had brewing technology embarked on the cultivation of grapes. It was in 2010 this culminated in rave reviews emerging from London regarding Japanese wine, leading to worldwide recognition. People started to find out that this wine was derived from the unique Japanese grape variety of Koshu, and this continues today. It was in 2010 that we really started exporting wine to the rest of the world. In general, the variety of grape can be a very plain and simple guideline to understanding wine. Especially in Europe, when writing a grape variety on a label, it is necessary to register with the OIV, which is the organization that determines grape and wine quality standards. By registering with OIV, our contents became consistent with the name of Koshu on the label, and this was extremely advantageous for marketing our wine. For me, making wine is like climbing mountains. You climb one mountain to find there is another one beyond. It is a lifetime challenge.
Today, Japanese wines have reached a level that rivals the world's most prestigious wines and are exported to over 20 countries around the world. Despite no administrative support, Yamada Yukio and Takuma Norihisa, the first civilians to produce and sell domestic wine, were one step ahead of the government. Yamanashi Prefectural Governor Fujimura Shiro and Oto Matsugoro helped steer the winemaking onto the path of becoming a major industry. Maeda Masana and Katsuda Jiro focused on expanding vineyards. Takano Masanari and Tsuchiya Ryukin studied abroad for a short time in France, the home of wine, and worked hard to learn winemaking techniques. Miyazaki Kotaro focused his efforts on promoting and selling the product to consumers, working closely with Takano and Tsuchiya. There were a lot more wine merchants over the years who continued their quest for authentic winemaking, even if they were not always rewarded. Wine, a little-known product in Japan only 150 years ago, is now a beverage enjoyed by many Japanese people. People all over the world can also enjoy the incredible taste of Yamanashi wine because these pioneers built the winemaking industry from the ground up through repeated trial and error.
Did you enjoy this story? The beautiful color aroma, and taste. This unique and delicious flavor is down to the hard work and dedication of the pioneers of Japanese winemaking. In 2019, Yamanashi Prefecture declared itself a wine prefecture in response to its deep and historical association with wine. From the bottom of my heart, I would dearly love to serve Yamanashi wine to people all over the world. It is through this taste that the world may understand how great overcoming any challenge can be.